Hello plant lovers, it is Matthew in Melbourne welcoming you back to my channel. Thank you very much for finding me. If you're new here, I grow cold, cool, intermediate orchids here in Melbourne, Australia without a greenhouse, without any grow lights or heat mats or humidifiers. They're either indoors or outdoors or they're out of the pool. So if that sounds of any interest to you, do hit subscribe. I post every week and I am a complete amateur who knows nothing, struggling through the dark forest of growing orchids successfully here. And Exhibit A, plant lovers, is the topic of today's video, this species Oncidium. And it is Oncidium sphacelatum. Now this beauty is a species orchid, so this is as it is found in the wild, and its native range is basically Central America, extending a little bit to the very top, the very north of South America, but you know what I mean, that band across there, which plant lovers, I'm here to tell you, is otherwise known as quite warm / tropical. But I bought this from a plant seller in Australia, and it was a division. And he assured me that despite this being known as a warm to hot grower, it actually is really cold tolerant. I know, I could not believe it because everything you read about this orchid says completely the opposite, that it is a warm tropical lover, because look where it comes from. And it's also not a high altitude orchid, which can be why orchids in the tropics at high altitude can take cooler temperatures, because it's obviously cooler the higher you go up. Not this baby, it is comparatively low growing. So who knew that? Anyway, I'm very glad that I had that intel, because this orchid lives outdoors all year in my climate, undercover, protected from the rain, but it is taking those winter and nighttime minimums, and it's had a full winter. And our winter minimums here in Melbourne are hovering around the 6 degrees centigrade at the moment, which is about 42, 43 degrees Fahrenheit. So cold, but not freezing. It can sometimes go a little bit lower, but this is generally the average for Melbourne in winter in nighttime minimums. And it is particularly chilly at the moment. And look, it is blooming. The other curious thing too that I read about this is that it is a spring bloomer. And guess what, plant lovers? It is early winter. So I think what we should do is go outside and see exactly where this baby is living. And if you've watched my grow space video, you will know exactly where we're heading, and I'll link that above. It's winter, it's a miserable day. Here we are outside, and it's over here. Here we are. Ta-da! There we go. There's the beautiful flowers. So as you can see, it is outdoors. On my table here, we have got the transparent roof above, which gives a lot of bright indirect light all year. And in winter, this spot does get quite a lot of direct sort of mid-afternoonish light and a little bit of morning light from over in that direction, which is east. So there you can see it is a large and happy little orchid. You can see it is a miserable wet day now. Nighttime minimums can get to about 5 degrees centigrade, which is about 42, 43 degrees Fahrenheit. Although a week ago we did get down to 2 degrees centigrade, which is 34, 35 Fahrenheit. Chilly, chilly, chilly. This just laps it up, and I kind of don't know why, given its tropical homeland. And flowers have lasted a long time, well over probably 6 weeks at this point. But let's have a little closer look at the plant. Now, as you can see, it is quite a big beast. Now, look at the length of that spike. I would say that is nearly a meter. It's probably nearly 2 feet long. It's enormous, and all the flowers are gathered at the end. So here's the first thing I'm going to talk about, which is perhaps a negative, and I'm sorry, Oncidium, don't listen, is that whenever I've Googled this and I've seen other examples of it, they have these wonderful sort of waterfalls, cascades of huge amounts of yellow golden blossom. And mine has these blooms at the end of a very long spike. I actually saw an Australian seller who said the common name for this was golden shower. Let's not go there. Anyway, I bought this plant as a division, so you can see it had some really chunky pseudobulbs at the back there, which have duly produced babies, which is wonderful. And when I bought it, it was actually in spike, and that spike had this same habit. So a very extended spike with a cluster of flowers on a bit of a branching sort of system at the top here. So it's clearly the habit that this particular specimen wants to grow like. So I don't think it's necessarily a reflection of my growing conditions. That is, perhaps you might assume when things are leggy, they're kind of reaching for the light. I don't know. I just wonder if this one just wants to be leggy. If you grow Oncidium sphacelatum, I'd be interested to know what your flowering habit's like, because maybe I've just got a curious individual that has a very particular flowering habit. Anyway, I don't really mind because it is quite beautiful. You can see the yellow is amazing and the flowers are very Oncidium-like, and you can see, I think, quite clearly how this species Oncidium, so species means that this plant is as you find it in the wild in that band of Central America. But you can quite clearly see how this has been the parent of so many Oncidium and Oncidium alliance hybrids. That yellow color with those tan spots. This is sort of its more simpler country cousin perhaps, and then all its sort of high-blown, overblown relatives that have got more color or more fragrance. But this is actually, it's quite beautiful, quite simple. Talking of fragrance, Oncidium's often fragrant, and you know, if I had to put money on it, I'd say yes, there is a very, very vague vanilla fragrance. So it kind of has traces of that fragrance you might find in the Sherry Baby types of Oncidium hybrids, but really, no. This is not something that when you walk past, you'll go, oh, what is that amazing perfume? For me though, the great thing about this Oncidium is that I know 100% it can stay outside all year and it can take those winter minimums. Because, plant lovers, the other little trick in its repertoire is that it is a very big plant. Now this is not a very big plant yet, but I would say it's certainly not small at this point. But everywhere that I read about this plant does say how massive it can be. So I think if the length of the flower spike is anything to go by, I think we can assume that's true. So that means that being able to keep it outside and basically treat it like an outdoor potted plant means that I can give it all the space that it needs and not have to worry about bringing it indoors in winter and trying to find somewhere to accommodate it as its girth increases, like the best of us with age. So as I said, it is winter now. It's early winter in Australia. We've got this flower spike, and this was when it flowered last time when I bought it. So I must have bought it probably about 12 months ago, and it had a spike which a couple of the flowers didn't make it, but it still managed to open most of the buds that were on that spike. I didn't make a video then because I feel it's cheating. I feel I can make videos when I've actually got the thing to bloom, or there's a problem, Houston. But this one is exhibiting classic Oncidium growth patterns. So you have your mature older pseudobulbs, and then that produces a growth from the bottom which matures, and in a 12-month period that pseudobulb matures and is able to flower. Often with species orchids, they do only flower once in a year, and often they're hybrid relatives are the ones that have been bred to flower multiple times in the year. So I think that is true of this one, that I will only get one lot of flowering in the year. But who knows, again, perhaps if you grow this, you can tell me otherwise. It's all going to be dependent on how many new growths you get and when they mature, I think. So if I could get 2 growths a year, I could get 2 flower cycles a year. And talking of maturity, this pseudobulb that has flowered actually isn't fully mature yet. So the bulb hasn't really thickened up, which again, quite common with a lot of Oncidiums, that they will flower just before you think the pseudobulb has actually matured. Potting wise then, as you can see, terracotta pot, because I am a terracotta pot kind of guy, and medium wise, it's in a fairly standard Oncidium mix for me, which is a medium bark mixed with charcoal, mixed with perlite, a little bit of sphagnum moss, all mixed up in a gorgeous melange. And I will link up here the video that I made about my general potting, which gives you my basic Oncidium mix recipe. Essentially though, it's an epiphyte like many orchids, and it just wants a light aerated mix that doesn't retain moisture for too long. It needs to be free draining and allow the roots to dry out reasonably between each watering. And so saying, talking of watering, I water more in the warmer seasons. That could be every 2 or 3 days if it's really warm. And then in winter, obviously, I just dial that down. But A lot of that is dependent upon its growth cycle. So this plant obviously was still producing that new growth and maturing as we were getting into autumn and early winter, and it's blooming. So not the time to really dial down the watering while that growth was still maturing. So this one doesn't really have sort of a rest period. Just generally in winter, I just dial down the watering and basically eliminate the fertilizing. However, if your orchid is wanting to grow and have a bit of a growth spurt, then you will need to fertilize it because these new growths are going to need some action. But it is early winter now, and I can say that there are no new growths. So it will produce its new growths in spring, which is the logical time to start feeding it again. And let's talk food because it is lunchtime. I put a couple of grains of slow release fertilizer into the mix, and then every spring a topical application of a few more grains of slow release fertilizer, and then during the warmer period, so spring through to summer through into autumn, depending when autumn turns too cold, a liquid fertilizer. So maybe every 2 or 3 waterings I will dilute a liquid fertilizer, and that could be anything, orchid specific, flowering orchid specific, or a generic liquid fertilizer, which you would use for basically any house plants. I always dial down the dilution quite a bit to about 1/6, 1/8 of what's recommended, because I do think it's easy to overdo it. So there we are, plant lovers, Oncidium sphacelatum. I'm really happy with it because quite literally, I just leave it outside. It does its business. Once a year, it produces this beautiful spike of blooms. And if I can grow on the plant a bit more and start to get multiple growth points, I'll start to get a big specimen and multiple spikes, and it really will look amazing. And if this is all mine is going to do, this sort of cluster of blooms at the top of a very long spike, well, so be it. I am happy to accept you as you are. But do let me know below if you have experience growing this and what your growth habit is like, because I am curious to know whether this just happens to be a quirk characteristic of the clone or the form that I've got, or whether it's sort of more common, or whether it is just a question that it needs really much more stronger light. But I don't think it does. It's pretty standard Oncidium care for me, and all my others bloom perfectly with the sort of the right proportion of spike and bloom. So who knows, plant lovers, but perhaps you do, so let me know below. There we go. So Oncidium sphacelatum and I are saying goodbye. Thank you very much for watching. I do post every week, so hit subscribe if you think this is of any interest, my amateur ramblings through growing orchids, and I look forward to seeing you next week with another adventure. Who knows what it might be, but until then, take care.